How to forward webhooks to Jenkins using Cloudflare. Sometimes you have to run your Jenkins controller behind a firewall, so therefore you can't receive webhooks from the outside world. By using Cloudflare, we now have an option to be able to resolve that issue. Here's today's starting point. I have a Jenkins LTS controller version 2.332.1. I have an agent attached to this controller, and I also have a third box where we're going to be running our tunnel back to Cloudflare. Now we're going to be following the example that Cloudflare provides for setting up your first tunnel. Now you have two options here. You can either do a dashboard setup or you can do a CLI setup. And in our case, we're going to be using the CLI setup. Now, obviously, there are some prerequisites that you need to have. First off, you need a Cloudflare account, which I have. If we take a look at this account, I've also already set up a domain. That is a requirement. If you've used other services in the past, you would just get a domain name based on that service. But with Cloudflare, we're going to need a domain already set up inside of Cloudflare. And also taking a look back at the documentation, we have to set up our domain name servers to Cloudflare. So the name servers within my registrar are set to the domain names that Cloudflare gave me. So 2 items, really 3. You need a Cloudflare account. You need to add a website to Cloudflare. And then you need to change the domain name servers, the NS records within your registrar, to the ones that Cloudflare provides. So those are the prerequisites. To get started, we need to install Cloudflare. Now I've already done that on my tunnel machine. Now let's take a look at my tunnel machine real quick. Again, my Cloudflare binary is already installed. Unable to find a config file, that's fine for right now. I know it's installed and it's on the path. However, because of some things that we're going to be doing in a few moments, I'm going to go ahead and become root. And just for sanity's sake, let's go ahead and check out Cloudflare one more time. So we can already see that Cloudflare is installed. It's on the path just by typing Cloudflare, so we're good to go from this point. Finally, since I'm on a machine that is not my Jenkins controller, I need to have name resolution. I don't have to have it, but I want it. I want name resolution from my tunnel machine to my Jenkins controller. And if I type ping Jenkins, which is the name of my Jenkins controller, I can see that it's resolving to this 192.168.56.13 address. So at this point, I have become root. I know that Cloudflare is set up and on path, and I'm able to do name resolution back over to my Jenkins controller. So let's go back over to our instructions and take a look at this. The very first step that we need to do once everything's done, prerequisites, and we have the binary installed, is we need to do a login to the tunnel. Okay, so let's go back over to our CLI and say Cloudflare tunnel login. Now you'll notice that we need to open a URL. And it's checking for a certificate that's going to be downloaded to this tunnel machine. However, this tunnel machine is running headless. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to go back over to my browser and just paste it in. We'll see that it's loading. And then it says, hey, do you want to go ahead and authorize the Cloudflare tunnel? I'm just going to click on this domain because it's the only domain I have, and then click on authorize. Then it tells me it's been successful. Let me go ahead and come back over here, and we can see that we have been successfully logged in. And if you want to copy your credentials to a server, they've been saved to this path on our tunnel machine. Let's go back over to our documentation. Let's look at our next step. We need to create a tunnel and give it a name. So in our case, what we're going to do is we are going to create a tunnel called Jenkins. So we'll come back over here and say Cloudflare tunnel create Jenkins. And what it says here are the tunnel credentials were written to /root.cloudflare. Notice that's the same path that we saw for our certificate that was downloaded. It gives us a uuid.json. So the tunnel was created. Let's take a look inside of that directory. At this point, we have our cert.pym and we have a JSON file with that uuid. Let's go back over to our documentation. We can confirm the tunnel that's been successfully created. Let's just run this tunnel list. And we can see here at the very last line, here's our ID, the name of the tunnel, and when it was created. Let's go back to our instructions. Next, we need to create a configuration file. And since we're going to be connecting an application, we have Jenkins running behind a firewall, stuck in a private network, but I'm setting up a tunnel. That's what we're doing. We are not connecting a network, we are connecting an application. So let's go ahead and go back over to our tunnel machine, and this configuration file needs to be named config.yaml. It is in our .cloudflared location. We could specify it in a different place, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just keep it in this directory. And the contents, and let me go and copy and paste them, sort of, is not that, undo, is that. So our URL is going to be HTTP Jenkins 8080. So for our tunnel, what we're going to have is it's going to be secure from the public outside world to Cloudflare, but from Cloudflare to my Jenkins controller, it's going to be non-secure, meaning no SSL involved. There are different ways you can set up your tunnel within Cloudflare. I'm just taking the default settings for this video. So in this case, I'm not going to try to set up SSL on my Jenkins controller. I'm just going to let it run without an SSL certificate. Then you'll also notice I have tunnel ID here in two places, one for the tunnel and one for the credentials file. If you think about it for just a moment, this is the tunnel ID. So I'm going to copy this, and let's go back into my config.yaml, and I'm going to do a quick replacement of tunnel-uuid with the actual value. So now my config.yaml is complete. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's go back to our documentation. We've created the configuration file. Now we're ready to start routing traffic. But you might be saying, okay, well, how does Cloudflare know where to route the traffic? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to create our tunnel. Let's go ahead and set this back up. Let's clear that off. We're going to say Cloudflare D tunnel route DNS. So we're going to be using DNS to route it. Our tunnel ID, which I need to copy from here. We'll fix that. And then you'll notice that I have a Jenkins.codes101, which is the domain name that I have set up inside of Cloudflare. And then we'll go from there. Now, before we do this, let's go back over to Cloudflare. Let's take a look at Codes 101 and then look at DNS. Within DNS, you'll see that I have some MX records set up and a couple of TXT records. So there is no reference to a Jenkins.codes101 yet. Let's go back over and let's run this command. And what you can see here is that it's added a CNAME of Jenkins code 101, which will route to this tunnel with the tunnel ID that I had specified. Now, just to prove that out, let's go back over to DNS. Let's refresh this page. And what we'll see now is we have a Jenkins entry here that is now proxied with the content of that tunnel ID. But we're still not there just quite yet. All we've done is set up the tunnel. Now we are ready to run the tunnel. So we have a choice here. We could either say run the UUID or we could run it by name. In our case, I'm just going to go ahead and say Cloudflare tunnel run. And I'm going to use the UUID since I have it here. Okay, well, I missed one character. Let's do that. And let's run this ID, which I have right here. So we can see that the tunnel is being started. We see that it's pulling in the settings that we defined within our config.yaml. It generated a connector. There's also a local metrics, so I could watch the metrics if I wanted to. But note this one item. Cloudflare D will not automatically update when run from the shell. We'll revisit this in just a few moments. And then finally, the last 4 lines, we have actually not just one connection, but 4 connections coming in from a location of IAD, which is in the Washington, D.C. area. So at this point, the tunnel is set up. So let's go ahead and test that. Let's go back over to our controller. You can see here that we're going to Jenkins :8080. So I'm using my inside network, not outside network. Let's click on dashboard. I'm going to say https jenkins.codes101.com. And you can see that we have a login screen. If I go ahead and log in, and I zoom in a little bit, everything looks to be the same because it is the same. But if we go to Manage Jenkins, you'll notice that we have a reverse proxy warning about it being broken. If we go to Configure System and scroll down to the Jenkins URL, let's go ahead and change this to HTTPS codes 101, put the trailing slash on and click Save. We're still logged in. We go to Manage Jenkins and now notice that that reverse proxy error is gone. So at this point, we are accessing our Jenkins controller from the outside world through Cloudflare, down the Cloudflare tunnel, down to the Jenkins controller that I have running locally within my network. Now, one thing that you may have noticed going back to our tunnel is that we just started this tunnel up manually. So if I do a Control-C, the tunnel has now been torn down, which is what you would expect. And if I go back over to my Jenkins controller, I'm getting an error that there's no tunnel here. So how do we do that? Because if we ran things just from the command line like that, if the machine was rebooted and it wasn't started back correctly, your tunnel would be non-existent. So what we can do is we can go ahead and set up our Cloudflare D as a service. And fortunately, there's some documentation for that. Now, configuring Cloudflare D as a service, by default, it expects all of the configuration to exist in the $home.cloudflaredd.config.yaml configuration file, which is where we created that file with that specific file name, no A in YAML. And then once I know that everything was working, which is what we should do first, so we're not chasing down, is it a service problem or not? So we did it manually. What we're ready to do now is go ahead and install the service, which fortunately, Cloudflare D gives you the built-in capability to do. That's also the reason I became root. And then we'll start up the service. So let's go ahead and copy this. Let's go back over to our tunnel machine. Let's go ahead and do the installation. So figured out, okay, I'm going to use systemd. The Linux service was installed successfully. Let's go ahead and start it. And finally, let's go ahead and do a status on this. And I'm going to add in one extra character here since I'm on CentOS. I'm going to do a -L. Now let's take a look at the output of our service. It loaded up the Cloudflare D service. If we take a look at the way it's running opt tools Cloudflare D. This is the binary that I installed prior to starting up recording this video. And this binary was in this directory that I created. Now also notice how the service set this up. It set it up to no auto update. The config file by default, remember it said in the documentation, is config.yaml, which is right here, and then tunnel run. So this command is very similar to what we ran manually, but now it's running as a service. So if for some reason that our machine that was running the tunnel restarts, and we've enabled this service to auto restart on machine restart, the tunnel will be reestablished and everything will work as expected. Now the purpose of this video is to show how to forward webhooks. And for this example, the webhook that we're going to be forwarding is from GitHub. I have a sample application. That's at Darren Pope Multibranch Sample App. Wherever it's coming from doesn't really matter. It's just a sample app that I want to go ahead and tie in to this controller. So before we do anything else, what I want to do is I want to go to Settings, and I want to go ahead and set up a webhook. Now, there are multiple ways to either have Jenkins manage the webhooks for you or manually set up the webhook. I want to go down the manual route so you can see how to do it in case in your situation you're unable to allow Jenkins to manage webhooks for you. So I'm going to add a webhook. The payload URL, looking at my notes, is going to be our Cloudflare URL, https jenkins.codes101.com, and then specifying where the webhook lives, which in our case is going to be GitHub-webhook. Don't forget the trailing slash. So this is the payload URL. The content type is going to be application JSON. No secret is required. I'm going to leave enable SSL verification on because Cloudflare is giving me a valid SSL certificate on that domain. And I'm also going to allow GitHub to send me everything, not just push events. Let's go ahead and add the webhook. And if we go ahead and click back into this webhook, we can see there's a recent deliveries tab. Let's click on that. And we can see that there's a green check mark. If we click into it, we can see that the response was a 200, meaning that when this webhook was sent, it was sent over to Cloudflare. Cloudflare forwarded it down the tunnel to us, and we responded with a successful answer. Now, next up, what we need to do is we need to set up credentials within GitHub that we will use over in our controller. Now, you may have used GitHub apps in the past, which you can do, but for this example, I'm just going to be using a personal access token. Now, I've already created the personal access token, but I want to go ahead and show you how to do it. You would click on Settings, go down to Developer Settings, and then click on Personal Access Tokens. And you can see here I have a handful of personal access tokens. The one that is created and we're going to be using is this one for temp Jenkins codes 101. I already have that one copied off to the side. We're going to use that token when we create our credentials. Down in the description is a link to a gist that has the links off to all the documentation, including a knowledge base article from CloudBees on how to properly configure the events that you need to set up when you create your personal access token. So let's go ahead and go back over to our controller. And since we've restarted the tunnel as a service, let's refresh this. And we're back in, we're still logged in. Let's create two credentials. First credential I need to create is a secret text credential. And then I'll show you where that's going to be used in a few moments. We'll say add credentials, secret text. The ID is going to be GC secret text as well as the description. And the actual secret, which you won't be able to see, is the token, which is just one long string. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. That's the first one. The second one that we're going to be creating is a username password type. My username is Darren Pope. That is my GitHub username. The password is going to be the access token value, just like the one that we just used in the secret text. And the ID for this one is going to be GH user pass. Put that in the description as well. So we've created two credentials. I've created a GC secret text. You could ID and description it however you want, but the value of that secret is the personal access token. And the GitHub user pass, or the GH user pass credential, the user ID is your GitHub user ID, in my case, Darren Pope, and the password is the value of the personal access token. Let's go into our controller, go to Manage Jenkins, and configure system. And what we're going to be doing is setting up a credential within our controller to be able to interact with GitHub from the controller back to GitHub in an authenticated manner. So if we look for GitHub, what we'll see here is add a GitHub server, which is what we're going to do. The name is just going to be GitHub. You can name it whatever you want. The API URL stays the same. Now, in my case, the API URL references back to github.com, which is what I want. And the credential that I want to use is the GC secret text. This is the only valid credential that I can use. The user pass one can't be used here. And then finally, I'm going to click on Test Connection. And if it's successful, what it's going to say is credentials verified for the user, whatever user ID it was that is associated with this access token. And it gives you a rate limit number. Let's go ahead and click on Save. Now let's go ahead and create our pipeline job. It's actually going to be a multi-branch. We're going to add a branch source of GitHub, since we're going to be working with GitHub specifically. Our credential is going to be GHUserPass, which once we selected that, it says, oh, user Darren Pope. I know who you are. That's great. That's exactly what I want. Let's take a look back at our repository here. Let me copy the URL. We'll paste that in. And just for reference, we can see that we have a Jenkins file on that branch, the main branch. We also have another branch that has another Jenkins file on it. And there are also some pull requests that are sitting out here as well. None of these really matter. And in fact, when we run this, you're going to see that the job fails. I don't really care about the jobs succeeding or failing right now. I just care that the webhook is going to be received. So first up, let's go ahead and make sure all of the rest of the settings are correct by Jenkins file. It is. Let's go ahead and click on Save. It's going to scan the repository. It's going to find the branches. It found branches on main, on 01 warnings in G. It found it for the 4 different pull requests. I'm good with all of that. And in fact, you can see that everything is starting to spin up. Jobs are working or not working, as the case may be. And in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and terminate all of these waiting jobs because I don't really care about the state of these jobs at this point. I just care that it was able to find it and scan it and set it up and get us to the point now to where we're ready to test our webhook. Now, before we go and test that webhook out, on the left nav of a multi-branch job, you're going to see multi-branch pipeline events. If you go ahead and click into that, you're going to see that no events as of this time, and it's waiting for events. We'll come back and visit this in just a few moments. Let's go back over to our repository. We're just going to work on the main branch, and let's just make a change to the README. Again, I don't care if the job works or doesn't work at this point. I'm just testing, is the webhook working as expected? So I'm going to make a change to my README. I'm going to say Add Content. I'm going to go down and click on Commit Changes. So I did that. Let's go back over to our controller, go back into our job. And within just a moment, what we should see is that the main branch has been queued up. So if we click on Multi-Branch Pipeline Events, we can see here that we received a push event to branch main in the repository from this IP address. And since it knows that it was only for main, it only triggered the main job that was related to the main branch. So if we come back over and take a look here, we can see that main is currently running. I'm going to go ahead and stop this job from running. But I want to show you one more thing. Within this job, even though it didn't succeed or fail because I stopped it, notice the very first line within the console output for this branch. The push event to branch main is what caused this job to start as that webhook was passed from GitHub to Cloudflare, down the tunnel, to my Jenkins controller running inside of my network. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to us on Twitter @CloudBees. If this video was helpful to you, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to CloudBees TV yet, why not? Take a moment, click on that subscribe button, and then ring that bell, and you'll be notified anytime there's new content available on CloudBees TV. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.